My name is Clara. I'm 31 years old, and the moment my world cracked open was at my mother's funeral. While mourners whispered condolences and organ music echoed in the chapel, the lawyer unfolded her will. I sat frozen in the front pew, clutching tissues damp with grief. And then I heard the words that sliced through me sharper than any eulogy could. Everything, our family home, the savings, the land, goes to Lydia, my younger sister. And to me, nothing. Not even a line that acknowledged my years of sacrifice. For 5 years, I had nursed my mother through illness, sold my jewelry to cover her medication, and given up chances at a career abroad. Yet in the eyes of my own family, I was invisible. As Lydia accepted sympathetic hugs, I stared at the polished coffin and wondered, was this my mother's final judgment? Or had someone twisted her last words into a weapon? That was the moment my life veered into a path I never expected. A single envelope tucked inside an old Bible would reveal that nothing in this family was as it seemed. Betrayal, hidden truths, and a battle for justice. This story is not just about inheritance, but about finally learning my worth. If you've ever felt overlooked by the very people who should have loved you most, stay with me. And don't forget, hit like and subscribe so you won't miss the twists and revelations waiting just ahead. I grew up in a house where silence spoke louder than words. My mother, Margaret, was a woman of iron routines and fragile affections. She adored appearances, fresh flowers on the dining table, polished silver for guests, the illusion of order. But beneath that polished surface, cracks spread like hairline fractures in porcelain. I was the daughter who learned early to patch those cracks without being asked. At 16, I worked after school to pay for my own books because money was tight. At 21, when Lydia wrecked her first car, I was the one who signed the loan papers to replace it. And when our mother's health began to falter, it was me who moved back into the small bedroom with peeling wallpaper, the one I'd painted yellow as a child, so I could be there for every doctor's visit, every midnight call for water. Lydia, meanwhile, was the golden child, carefree, adored, forgiven. When she missed family dinners, the excuse was always, she's busy, she's young, she deserves freedom. When I missed one, it was labeled ingratitude. There was never a scale that measured us equally. The weights had been fixed long before I was born. Still, I believed, foolishly perhaps, that devotion would be noticed, that if I carried enough burdens, love would eventually balance the books. That's the cruel bargain children make with their parents. We trade years of loyalty for a few moments of recognition. But recognition never came. And so, when the will was read and my name left blank, it felt less like a mistake and more like the final stamp of a lifelong sentence. A confirmation that in my family's eyes, I was always the extra guest at the table, tolerated, but never chosen. Yet even in that devastation, a question burned brighter than grief. What if the truth was different? If my mother's will was the final blow, the years leading up to it were the rehearsal? My family always played their roles with conviction. My father, the silent overseer, Lydia, the adored ingenue, and me, the understudy who never left the wings. Father was a man of posture more than presence. He'd sit at the head of the table, shoulders square, eyes fixed on his plate, as though the meatloaf might reveal the mysteries of the universe. His silence wasn't wisdom, it was abdication. And his silence gave Lydia all the room she needed to shine. Lydia. She was laughter at midnight, perfume lingering in the hallways, promises left half fulfilled but always forgiven. She didn't just walk into a room. The room bent itself toward her, as if gravity had been rewritten in her favor. When she failed, it was a phase. When I succeeded, it was expected. To them, she was the sun. To me, she was the shadow I could never escape. And yet, there were others in the orbit. Aunts who clucked about duty but never lifted a finger. Uncles who congratulated Lydia on trivial victories, but never once asked me about my work. At holidays, the seating chart itself told the story. Lydia centered between my parents, her laughter gilded by candlelight, while I was tucked at the edge, careful not to spill wine on the tablecloth. Even the walls of that house seemed to conspire. Family photos hung in frames of polished oak, Lydia's milestones proudly displayed. My own pictures were smaller, pushed to the corners, like punctuation marks in someone else's story. I used to think this imbalance was survivable, that one day the scales might tip. But funerals have a way of clarifying what dinners only disguise. My mother's will wasn't an aberration. It was the inevitable conclusion. And yet, that secret envelope, that trembling hint of another truth, whispered that the story might not be finished after all. The will should have ended the story. That's what everyone thought. Lydia basked in the glow of her inheritance. Relatives murmured polite consolations, and I was expected to slip quietly back into my modest apartment and continue my life as if nothing had shifted. But grief has a way of loosening what people work so hard to keep hidden. It was a week after the funeral when I found it. I'd gone back to the house alone to gather what little remained of my belongings. The living room still smelled faintly of lilies and stale perfume, as if the air itself hadn't moved on. I was dusting my mother's old bookcase, a ritual I'd done hundreds of times, when a weathered Bible slipped from the shelf. It landed with a hollow thud, pages fluttering open to reveal a sealed envelope pressed between Psalms and Proverbs. My name, Clara, written in my mother's hand. For a long moment I couldn't breathe. The paper trembled in my fingers like something alive. Inside, a single page, brief as a confession. If you are reading this, then the truth belongs to you. Trust the house by the lake. What was hidden there will explain everything. Mother. The words didn't fit the woman I knew. So careful, so devoted to appearances. This letter was raw, almost desperate, and it raised more questions than it answered. Why mention the lake house, the one everyone believed had been sold years ago? Why leave me nothing in the will, yet leave this clue like breadcrumbs scattered through the dark? That night, I spread the letter on my kitchen table and stared at it under the dim bulb. It felt like the first honest conversation I'd ever had with her, and she wasn't even alive to hear it. I should have ignored it, chalked it up to grief and wishful thinking. But something inside me had shifted the moment I read her words. After decades of being dismissed, excluded, erased, here was the first hint that I mattered, that perhaps the story my family told about me wasn't the truth after all. So I made a choice. I would go to the lake house. I would uncover whatever secret my mother had buried there. Because if the will was her final act on stage, this letter was the whisper behind the curtain. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter spread before me, the ink already beginning to blur where my thumb had pressed too hard. The words were so few, and yet they carried the weight of years. Trust the house by the lake. It echoed in my mind like scripture recited in an empty church. Part of me wanted to believe it was nonsense, some half-formed thought of a woman whose body was failing her. But another part, the part that had survived years of silence and shadows, recognized something more. It was as if my mother had finally spoken to me, without the mask she wore for everyone else. Still, fear gnawed at me. What if the house was gone? What if I opened its doors and found only dust and memories? Worse, what if Lydia already knew, and this secret was never meant for me at all? I turned the letter over again and again, searching for hidden meaning, for a code only a daughter could decipher. Nothing changed, except the certainty that I couldn't go on pretending. Not after this. So I made coffee at midnight, packed a small bag, and laid the letter on top of my clothes like a compass pointing toward something I didn't yet understand. I didn't tell anyone. Not my colleagues at school, not the few friends who still called. For once, this was mine alone. And as dawn crept through the blinds, I realized my life was already split in two, before the letter and after. What waited at the lake house might shatter me further, or finally prove that I had never been invisible at all. The days that followed felt like walking through a play, where everyone knew their lines except me. Lydia held court at the family home, sipping wine on the porch like a queen surveying her kingdom. Relatives came and went, offering congratulations as if she had achieved something remarkable, as if inheriting was a talent. When I arrived to collect the last of my things, she looked at me over the rim of her glass. "Don't linger, Clara. Mother wanted peace, not tension." The words were casual, but they cut like glass hidden in velvet. Peace, in her mouth, meant silence, my silence. An aunt patted my hand, whispering, "At least Lydia will take care of the family place. You wouldn't have the time, dear." As if my years of caring for Mother had been a hobby, not a sacrifice. As if love could be measured only in property deeds and dinner parties. Even the house seemed to agree. My old bedroom door stuck as I tried to open it, and Lydia's laughter floated up the stairwell like a reminder that some doors were never meant for me. The family photos had already been rearranged. Her wedding portrait in the center, my picture from college graduation pushed to the far corner, half hidden by a vase. I should have been used to it. These small erasures had been happening all my life. But now, after the letter, every slight felt heavier, like the universe itself was insisting I see the truth I had ignored. They were never going to choose me. And maybe, for the first time, I didn't need them to, because somewhere by that lake, my mother had left a different choice, one only I could uncover. The lake house stood at the end of a dirt road, half hidden by overgrown pines. To anyone else, it was just another piece of forgotten property, a relic swallowed by time. But to me, it felt like the stage where an unseen play was about to begin. The air smelled of damp wood and moss, heavy with the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The key was still under the stone frog by the porch, exactly where I'd hidden it years ago when Mother last brought us here. Lydia never bothered with such details. She came only for the parties, the photo ops by the dock. I, on the other hand, remembered the nights spent mopping rainwater from the basement, sealing cracks to keep the house from collapsing in on itself. When I pushed open the door, the hinges groaned like an old man refusing to rise. Dust floated in the slanted light, catching in my throat as I stepped inside. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The quilt folded neatly on the couch, the framed photo of my father fishing by the lake, the faint smell of cedar. And yet, there was something more, an undercurrent, like the whole house was holding its breath. I searched every corner, closets, drawers, the attic where old trunks slept beneath cobwebs. Hours passed, frustration mounting, until finally, in the basement, I saw it. A false wall behind the shelves, barely noticeable except for a thin crack of daylight. My hands trembled as I pushed the shelving aside, heart pounding with the rhythm of discovery. Behind it, a small wooden chest sat waiting. Not locked, just closed, as if daring me to open it. Inside were folders, meticulously labeled in my mother's handwriting, property deeds, bank statements, receipts. And on top, a document that made my knees weaken. The deed to this very house, signed solely in my name. Not Lydia's, not shared, mine. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It was as if my mother had reached from beyond the grave to whisper, "I saw you. I trusted you. This was always yours. The injustice of the will, the endless years of being erased, it all cracked under the weight of that single truth. I wasn't invisible. Not entirely. My mother had chosen me, even if she couldn't admit it in front of the others. And that choice changed everything. I didn't storm back into town waving the deed like a banner. That would have been too easy, too loud. And besides, Lydia thrived on drama. She would twist any confrontation into proof of my instability. No, I needed silence. Silence had always been the family's weapon against me. Now it would be mine. I carried the documents in a plain folder, tucked under my arm as I left the lake house. Every step down that creaking porch felt like rehearsal for a role I'd never played before, the woman who held the truth. I locked the door behind me, slid the key back under the stone frog, and drove away as if nothing had changed, though everything had. In the days that followed, I moved carefully. At school, I kept teaching as usual, smiling at students, grading papers late into the night. To anyone watching, I was the same Clara. But each evening, behind closed doors, I spread the papers across my dining table like a general studying maps of an upcoming battle. I contacted an old professor of mine, now a respected attorney. Over coffee, I slid him the deed, my voice low, my hands steady only because they had to be. He read in silence, eyes narrowing with each line. "This is legitimate," he said finally, tapping the signature with his finger. "Whatever was read in that will, it doesn't erase this. You have leverage, Clara. More than leverage. You have ownership." The word felt foreign on my tongue. Ownership. For so long, everything I touched belonged to someone else. My labor to my mother, my loyalty to my father, my sacrifices to Lydia. Now here was something undeniably mine. Still, I told no one. Not Aunt May, not the neighbors who watched me with pity after the funeral, certainly not Lydia. I let her keep parading through town, boasting about her new responsibilities, smiling for photographs in front of the family home. Let her enjoy the spotlight, because spotlights are blinding. They keep you from seeing what's building quietly in the dark. And in that darkness, for the first time, I wasn't shrinking. I was preparing. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with the name I hadn't seen in years, Professor Ellis. He had been more than a teacher back in college. He was the one who told me my voice mattered, back when my family insisted it didn't. He was also, as fate would have it, an attorney now. We met in a quiet cafe off Main Street, the kind of place where the hum of the espresso machine drowned out whispered secrets. I laid the folder on the table, the papers inside like dynamite disguised as ink and signatures. He studied them with the careful eyes of a man who had seen families torn apart by less. "This," he said finally, adjusting his glasses, "is not just paper. It's proof. Your mother wanted you protected, Clara. Somewhere along the way, that truth got buried." I felt the words strike something deep inside me. Protected. It had been so long since anyone framed me as worth shielding. Professor Ellis leaned closer, lowering his voice. "But you can't face this alone. Families like yours, they rewrite history with every dinner toast. You need someone to hold the line when they try to twist the story." He tapped the folder. "I can be that person, if you'll let me." For a moment, I couldn't speak. After years of being the solitary figure at the edge of family portraits, here was someone stepping into the frame beside me. Not out of pity, but conviction. I nodded, sliding the folder back toward him. "Then let's hold the line." And in that quiet cafe, with coffee cooling between us, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The fight that had begun in silence now had a voice, one that could be heard. The invitation came in the form of a phone call, Lydia's voice dripping with false sweetness. "We're having a little gathering at the house. Family only." You should come, Clara. It'll be good for appearances. Appearances. The word alone should have warned me. But some part of me still longed to belong, to prove I could stand in that room without shrinking. So I went. The living room glowed with chandeliers and laughter. Relatives filled their glasses, nibbling hors d'oeuvres served on the silver trays Mother once reserved for Christmas. Lydia stood in the center, radiant in a silk dress, the self-appointed heiress of our bloodline. I hovered at the edge, unnoticed, until she decided to notice me. "Oh, Clara!" she exclaimed, her voice rising just enough to draw eyes. "So glad you could take a break from grading papers. Everyone, isn't it admirable?" My sister gave up. Well, everything. To stay small. The room chuckled politely, some out of discomfort, others in agreement. Heat climbed my neck, but I stayed still. Lydia wasn't finished. She always had such modest ambitions. Meanwhile, Mother trusted me with the legacy. Responsibility isn't easy, but not everyone is cut out for it. She smiled, the kind of smile meant to wound while looking gracious. An uncle raised his glass. "To Lydia, the future of the family." Crystals clinked. My name was absent from every toast. I glanced at the mantel. Sami Ai, graduation photo once framed, was gone, replaced with Lydia's wedding portrait. My life erased with a swap of a picture. I caught my reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. A woman standing at the edge as always, but this time my eyes didn't lower. I thought of the folder now safe in Ellis's hands, the deed with my name in my mother's writing. Their laughter rang like nails hammered into wood, but for the first time I felt something shift. They thought I was cornered, humiliated. What they didn't know was that humiliation can be fuel, and silence can be a blade. So I smiled, not with surrender, but with promise. A promise they'd never see coming. The night after Lydia's party, I couldn't sleep. Their laughter still clanged in my ears, echoing off the hollow walls of my apartment. Every toast to her, every dismissive glance at me, pressed down like stones on my chest. But beneath the weight, something finally cracked open. Not despair this time, but defiance. I pulled out the letter from my mother, the deed, the receipts. I spread them across my dining table the way some families spread photographs, a gallery of truth instead of illusion. The lamp cast sharp shadows over the papers, the kind of light that reveals what darkness tries to swallow. For the first time, I saw my family's cruelty not as inevitable, but as fragile, as something that could be undone. The next morning, I drove back to the lake house. Fog curled over the water like secrets reluctant to lift. In the basement, I searched deeper, prying open boxes my mother had hidden behind the false wall. There were journals, her handwriting steady, her words sharper than I remembered. I couldn't protect Clara in life without risking Lydia's wrath. One entry read, "But I can leave her proof. One day, the truth will be her shield." My throat tightened. My mother had known. She had seen the imbalance, the favoritism, the cruelty. She had simply chosen silence while alive and left me a map to justice when she could no longer speak. But the explosion came not from her words. It came when I stepped out of the house and saw a car parked by the dirt road. Lydia's car. She was standing by the dock, phone pressed to her ear, her voice sharp enough to carry across the water. "Yes, she's here. She's digging around again. I told you, she won't let go. We'll have to handle it. Handle it." My stomach dropped. She wasn't just basking in her inheritance. She was protecting a lie. I froze, clutching the folder against my chest, realizing the danger wasn't abstract anymore. Lydia knew about the lake house. She knew I'd found something. And if she was willing to humiliate me in public, what was she willing to do in private? When she saw me, her smile was thin, brittle. "Clara, what are you doing here? This house isn't yours anymore. You shouldn't interfere." but her eyes flicked to the folder in my arms. And for the first time, she looked afraid. I walked past her without answering, my heart hammering. The truth was no longer a secret in a basement. It was alive, in my hands, and it had already started to burn through the lies. That night, I called Professor Ellis. "It's time," I told him. My voice shook, but not with fear, with resolve. The stage was set. The audience would be larger now. Lawyers, judges, the very relatives who had laughed at me. And the curtain was about to rise. The will had been their weapon. Now the truth would be mine. The moment I told Professor Ellis, "It's time," everything shifted. Until then, the truth had been a private weight, heavy in my hands but invisible to the world. Now it would be dragged into daylight, where lies can't hide as easily. We met in his office that Sunday, sunlight slanting through the blinds in sharp stripes across the desk. It felt less like a meeting and more like rehearsal for a trial that was half courtroom, half theater. He spread the documents between us, the deed, the journals, the receipts, each one a brick in the wall we were building. "You need to understand, Clara," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Once we file this, the family won't see it as justice. They'll see it as betrayal." I almost laughed. Betrayal? The word had lost its sting. How do you betray people who never truly claimed you? Still, I felt the tremor in my chest. Lydia would fight dirty, she always had. And our relatives, the same ones who toasted her while ignoring me, would rally behind her smile. Families don't love truth, they love comfort. And I was about to tear comfort apart. Ellis leaned forward. "We'll strike at the will's validity, show the court what your mother concealed for you. But timing matters. You can't tip your hand too early. Until the hearing, you say nothing. You do nothing. Let them believe you're still the quiet daughter in the corner." I nodded, the irony sharp. All my life I had been silent because they forced me to be. Now I would be silent by choice, waiting, watching, holding the blade until the exact moment to cut. The stage was set. And for once, I wasn't the understudy. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a place where lives were measured not in memories, but in documents. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Professor Ellis, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Across from me, Lydia glowed as if she were attending a gala instead of a hearing. Pearls at her throat, a smile trained for cameras that weren't even there. When the judge entered, everyone rose. My knees trembled, but I stood taller than I had at any family dinner. This was no longer their table, their rules. Here, the truth would have its say. The proceedings began with the reading of the will, the same familiar wound. My mother's voice, written in formal language, leaving everything to Lydia. The relatives behind her nodded solemnly, some throwing me pitying glances, as if I were reliving humiliation for sport. Then Ellis rose. His voice was steady, deliberate, each word landing like a hammer. "Your Honor, we contest the validity of this will on the basis of concealed documentation." He placed the folder on the table, opening it with the care of a surgeon. "Evidence shows that the deceased transferred ownership of the lake house to my client, Clara, years before this will was executed." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Lydia's smile faltered for the first time. The judge leaned forward. "Proceed." Ellis laid out the deed, notarized and signed in my mother's unmistakable hand. He presented the receipts, the tax records, the journals. Each piece was like a torch, burning away shadows. Lydia's attorney objected, claiming forgery, manipulation. But when Ellis called the notary to the stand, a man who swore under oath that my mother had personally signed the transfer, the defense stumbled. Finally, Lydia was called to testify. She stepped up confidently, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome. "My mother trusted me. she declared. She wanted me to carry the family's legacy. Clara was never responsible. She couldn't handle it. I felt every eye turn to me, waiting for collapse. But instead, I rose. My voice was steady, though my heart thundered. If responsibility means watching over our mother through every sleepless night, paying her bills, and maintaining a house you all pretended didn't exist, then yes, I carried it, alone. The silence was thick, heavy as smoke. I held up the journal Ellis had submitted. In her own words, my mother admitted she left me proof because she knew the truth would be buried otherwise. She saw me, even if none of you did. Lydia's face tightened, her mask slipping. She was confused near the end, she spat, but the desperation in her tone betrayed her. Ellis struck then. Confused women don't keep tax records accurate to the cent. Confused women don't sign notarized deeds. He turned to the judge. What we see here is not confusion. It's a family trying to erase the daughter who gave everything. The judge's gavel struck once. Enough. The evidence stands. The weight of the words filled the room. Lydia's shoulders sagged, her pearls suddenly too heavy for her neck. Behind her, our relatives shifted uncomfortably, whispering, avoiding my gaze. In that moment, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the extra seat at the edge of the table. I was the one holding the truth, and they had no choice but to see me. As the hearing adjourned, Lydia brushed past me, her perfume sharp, her voice a hiss meant only for my ears. This isn't over. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw what she didn't want me to see. Fear. And for the first time in my life, I realized fear could belong to them, not just to me. After court recessed for lunch, the hallway outside the courtroom buzzed like a hive cracked open. Relatives huddled in clusters, whispering, their glances sharp as knives when they slid toward me. For years, their silence had been my prison. Now it was their weapon turning dull in their hands. Lydia emerged, her attorney at her side, but her composure was fractured. The pearls at her throat no longer gleamed, they choked, and then the whispers began to swell, because Ellis had released another piece of evidence. Emails, dozens of them. They were projected on the courtroom screen when we reconvened. My mother's inbox, carefully preserved, telling a story Lydia had hoped would never see daylight. Messages to our aunt discussing arrangements, warnings to keep me uninformed. Even one line that froze the air in my lungs. Send Clara the wrong date. She can't be at the wedding. It would ruin the picture. The judge's gavel struck for silence, but it was too late. The facade had shattered. I watched my relatives turn, some faces shocked, others grim, a few finally ashamed. Lydia's mask slipped entirely when Ellis produced the final message, a draft she had written to my mother, begging her to rewrite the will, dangling promises of loyalty, and keeping the family name untarnished. My stomach twisted, not because I was surprised, but because the cruelty was now undeniable. Lydia hadn't simply benefited from favoritism. She had conspired to erase me. When asked to explain, she snapped. Her voice rose, sharp and desperate. Of course I protected what was mine. Clara was weak, always needing, always failing. Mother knew I was the strong one. But her words only condemned her. Strength isn't proven by stealing. Strength isn't proven by lies. And in that moment, even the judge's eyes narrowed with something colder than disapproval. Disgust. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. Because this wasn't victory. It was exposure. Like watching a mask fall away, revealing the emptiness underneath. And as Lydia sank back into her chair, trembling with rage, I realized the family had finally seen her. Not the golden child, not the heir, but the fraud she'd always been. When the judge finally spoke, the room seemed to still, as if the very air held its breath. The evidence presented is clear. Ownership of the lake house belongs solely to Clara. Furthermore, this court finds that the will in its current form does not reflect the full truth of the estate. The gavel struck, and in that sharp crack, years of erasure splintered. I sat frozen, not because I doubted the outcome, but because victory felt so foreign. All my life I had learned to brace for loss, to swallow injustice in silence. And now, for once, silence worked in my favor. Not my silence, but theirs. The silence of lies collapsing under the weight of proof. Behind me, relatives shifted uneasily, their whispers now a different pitch. No longer pity, no longer dismissal. Something closer to recognition. For the first time, I wasn't a shadow at the key. The edge of their story. I was the one standing in the light. Lydia crumpled in her seat, her eyes fixed on me with a mix of hatred and fear. Once, that look would have crushed me. Now, it only confirmed what the judge's words had already sealed. She could no longer define me. Ellis leaned toward me, voice low but steady. You won, Clara. Not just the house, your place. I thought of Mother's letter, of her journals, of the nights I'd spent doubting whether she ever truly saw me. And though she hadn't spoken the words in life, her actions in death had carried them to me. You mattered. As we left the courtroom, reporters waited, microphones ready, but I didn't stop. This wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about something far quieter and far more powerful. The knowledge that the truth had spoken for me when no one else ever had. For the first time in my life, I walked out not as the forgotten daughter, but as the rightful heir to my own story. Defeat doesn't always arrive with handcuffs or sirens. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in invitations that never arrive, in doors that quietly close. For Lydia, it came all at once. The family that once crowned her their golden child began to retreat. Aunts who toasted her at the party now avoided her calls. Uncles who once bragged about her promise muttered about her shame in grocery aisles. Reputation, the currency she valued most, was slipping through her fingers like sand. Even her husband, who had stood stiffly by her side through the hearing, seemed shaken. Within weeks, neighbors whispered that he'd move back into his parents' house. Without the money, without the glory, Lydia was no longer the prize he thought he'd won. Financially, the collapse was swift. The court ordered her to repay misused funds, debts she had hidden behind my mother's name. Creditors circled like vultures, and for the first time in her life, there was no one left to shield her. I didn't celebrate. Watching her unravel was not joy, it was confirmation. For years, she'd built her empire on borrowed trust, and now the bill had come due. One afternoon, I passed her on Main Street. She walked quickly, sunglasses pulled low, shoulders bent beneath the weight of stares she could no longer command. For once, she didn't look at me with scorn. She didn't look at me at all. And in that silence, I understood. Her punishment was not just losing the house or the money. It was losing the one thing she had always craved, an audience that believed in her shine. The lake house became more than property. It became sanctuary. The first night I slept there, the walls creaked like old friends clearing their throats after years of silence. I lay in the four-poster bed my mother once used and listened, not for footsteps, not for criticism, but for the sound of my own breathing, steady and unbroken. For the first time in decades, it felt like enough. Morning light spilled across the water in wide golden strokes, and I knew this place wasn't meant to sit in shadows. So I rolled up my sleeves. I repaired the shutters, painted the trim, planted wildflowers by the front steps. Every stroke of the brush, every nail driven into wood, felt like rewriting history. Not theirs, but mine. It wasn't just about reclaiming a home. It was about building a future. I reached out to the local school district, offering the house's guest cottage as a retreat for underprivileged students who needed quiet to study. I donated part of my inheritance to create scholarships, small at first, but enough to open doors that had always been closed to me. Neighbors began to stop by, not with whispers of pity, but with pies, tools, and laughter. For once, I wasn't the family's forgotten daughter. I was simply Clara, the teacher, the neighbor, the woman with the lake house where children came to learn and dream. At night, I walked down to the dock and watched the water ripple under the stars. I thought of my mother, of the secret she left tucked in that Bible, and of the words in her journal. The truth will be her shield. She had been right. The truth had not only shielded me, it had set me free. The life I was building wasn't grand, wasn't gilded, but it was mine, entirely, irrevocably mine. The lake house became more than property. It became sanctuary. The first night I slept there, the walls creaked like old friends clearing their throats after years of silence. I lay in the four-poster bed my mother once used and listened, not for footsteps, not for criticism, but for the sound of my own breathing, steady and unbroken. For the first time in decades, it felt like enough. Morning light spilled across the water in wide golden strokes, and I knew this place wasn't meant to sit in shadows. So I rolled up my sleeves. I repaired the shutters, painted the trim, planted wildflowers by the front steps. Every stroke of the brush, every nail driven into wood, felt like rewriting history. Not theirs, but mine. It wasn't just about reclaiming a home. It was about building a future. I reached out to the local school district, offering the house's guest cottage as a retreat for underprivileged students who needed quiet to study. I donated part of my inheritance to create scholarships, small at first, but enough to open doors that had always been closed to me. Neighbors began to stop by, not with whispers of pity, but with pies, tools, and laughter. For once, I wasn't the family's forgotten daughter. I was simply Clara, the teacher, the neighbor, the woman with the lake house where children came to learn and dream. At night, I walked down to the dock and watched the water ripple under the stars. I thought of my mother, of the secret she left tucked in that Bible, and of the words in her journal. The truth will be her shield. She had been right. The truth had not only shielded me, it had set me free. The life I was building wasn't grand, wasn't gilded, but it was mine, entirely, irrevocably mine. Looking back, I used to think the greatest wound was being left out of the will. But the truth is, that paper was only a symptom. The real wound was years of being unseen, of giving and giving while waiting for love that never arrived. What I've learned is simple, though it took me 3 decades to understand. Family is not defined by blood, but by behavior. Titles like mother, father, sister don't guarantee love. Love is proven in the quiet, in the everyday acts of showing up, of telling the truth, of protecting rather than exploiting. For years, I thought if I worked harder, sacrificed more, stayed smaller, I would finally earn a place at the table. But dignity isn't something you beg for. It's something you claim. And sometimes claiming it means stepping away, even if it means sitting at a new table, alone at first, until you discover you were never truly alone. The lake house taught me that. Its walls didn't care about appearances. Its floors didn't whisper judgments. It gave back exactly what I put in: effort, patience, care. That's what family should be. A place that reflects your love instead of consuming it. So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I want you to hear me. Your worth is not up for debate. You don't have to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. You don't need their permission to matter. Sometimes blood ties are chains, and sometimes breaking them is the only way to breathe. Tonight, I sit on the porch of the lake house, the air cool against my skin, the water carrying the last shreds of sunlight. For years, this place was a rumor, a forgotten line in a family story that always seemed to leave me out. Now, it is mine. Not just in name, but in meaning. I think of the girl I used to be, standing at the edges of family photos, waiting for someone to make space. That girl is gone. In her place is a woman who learned that absence can be its own kind of answer, and that sometimes the greatest gift is not what's left to you, but what you decide to build from it. As I close my mother's final letter, the one that started all of this, I don't feel bitterness anymore. I feel clarity. Family can wound, yes, but truth can heal. And now, I want to turn to you. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything? Share your story in the comments. I read them, every single one. And if this journey resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll never miss the next chapter. Because sometimes the stories we share are the very ones that set us free.